Okay, can we start? My name ליאן, אני רק המציג. My name is Avi Ori, and I want to start with. It's possible to close the door, please. With some kind of exercise, very short one, and may I ask all the audience, professors, students, photographers, everybody, to close their eyes. Totally close your eyes, please. Even you. And just imagine that you are incarcerated in a cell, blindfolded, your hands are tied behind your back. You don't know if it's day or night. You're hungry, you are thirsty, you're isolated. Sometimes you try to have a nap, but cries and shouts are out there, interrupt you. You don't know for how long you are in incarceration. You are a prisoner of war after a terrible war a few days before that. And suddenly you have an experience, a very bizarre experience, that very dear people are standing or sitting behind you and talk to you and encourage you and guide you. What is called the idea of presence. Someone else is very nearby, and you open your eyes, but of course you can see nothing. And in the first occasion, you see your spouse or friend or commander asking you to be out to discharge yourself and leave this prison, this horrible situation. And you woke up and nothing happened. You're still in the same darkness, the same uncertainty, the same struggles to survive. And now you can open your eyes and just imagine it was me about 45 years ago. I was a prisoner of war in Egypt as a young doctor. And, but you cannot forget it, but I continued with my life, my professional life, my family life. And about almost 30 years ago, I met Zahava Solomon. And I was already 2 years professor of rehabilitation medicine, and since then I'm still a student of Zahava. Not the younger one, but not the youngest, but every day I feel I have to learn more about trauma, more about PTSD, etc. It's my really honor to invite, that was just an introduction to the speakers. The first speaker will be Professor Elklit. I tried to, when you sent me your CV, I just imagined it would take me a semester just to read all the papers, maybe more. He's well known among scholars who are involved in trauma and stress. He started as an educational psychologist, but later entered the field of clinical and psychotherapy and psychotraumatology. The spectrum of population he and his team investigated is vast, and survivors of these disasters, refugees, veterans, patients with various diseases, young, old, those who were exposed to sexual abuse of all kinds. And we shall learn about his and his team efforts to build an organization structure for those people after trauma. He's the head of the Danish National Center for Psychotraumatology at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense. Ask, please.
This one, right?
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Dear Sahava, thank you for the invitation to come here. It's a big honor to be here and be a speaker. And Sahava, you had a profound impact on my way of being a researcher. Thank you for that. I want to talk about organizational structure and research and the interplay between the two. What do we know about the effects of interpersonal trauma and our chances to heal them? What are the organizational limits and means to overcome them? And can research make a difference in that matter? We'll talk about 3 different kinds of institutions. One is the rape victims and the institutions for them, and the treatment of rape victims. If you start with a definition of rape, there's a lot of material in that, but the definitions have an impact on the prevalences of rape, and also interesting on the level of distress, as Mary Koss showed many years ago. If you enlarge the definitions to any harassment, then you have very large figures for sexual abuse and potential rape. Some Danish studies had about sexual abuse had included at the very end of the questions if the sexual activities that the participant had experienced, if they were unwanted, and that meant there was a huge reduction. So we have to be aware of the feelings you have in the sexual interaction you have. But do the numbers matter? Yes, they do for the general understanding in the population and also, of course, for prevention and treatment. And if you define rape as evidence of penetration or penetration attempts, then it appears that 2 or 3% among Danish adolescents and young adults has been victims of rape. And what are the consequences of rape? There are many consequences, and there are large consequences. All previous studies have shown effects in all studied areas: physiological, psychological, and social. And the PTSD estimates is from 50 to 60% with modest reduction over time. So access to treatment is very important. And how shall it be organized and implemented? I was a co-founder of the first Center for Victims of Rape in Denmark, and we, inspired by the Americans, made a gate model that provides a collective entry point located near to the emergency rooms in the hospitals, composed by police, forensic, nurses, medical doctors, psychologists, and other professions to serve and treat the victims in one place, to solve a problem we had previously where victims had to go to many places to get help. The professionals work collaboratively. They share responsibility for the victims, for the center, and for the training and supervision of one another. This model has recently been adopted in the Netherlands, where 16 new centers have opened within the last few years. The judicial process is not part of the center. Just 13% of all reported cases end with a conviction. The punishment has steadily increased in Denmark. Most get 1 to or 2.5 years of prison, and the top limit is 8 years of prison. Now we come to the question, does the treatment work? In Aarhus, the place where I have lived and where this center was created, the victims we followed demonstrated high PTSD rate 3, 6, and 12 months after the treatment. And one of our studies indicated also high PTSD rates even after 5 years. So the effect of the treatment seems modest. And why is that? Many stopped after 1 or 2 sessions. Many of them were young and naive, and when they felt some symptom improvement, they usually left treatment. They want to go on with their lives, And some expected that the effects would increase by themselves. Now they felt the improvement and will probably just become better and better. 70% of the victims, they experienced contact rape. That means that they knew the identity of the rapist. Some of them and others were intoxicated or under the influence of drugs. We have a chance in Denmark. We have, all of us have a specific person number, civil person number, which is used in many registers. And using these registers, we found evidence of significant psychopathology and personality and social problems pre-rape. For instance, diagnosis of psychosis were 19 times more common among the rape victims than in controls. And likewise, diagnosis of anxiety were 10 times more common in rape victims than in controls. And we also studied a number of other factors, but among them the visits to the general practitioner. The rape victims had 50% more visits than controls pre-rape. After the rape, the magnitude of psychosis and anxiety diagnosis increased by a factor 10 and 6 respectively. So the trauma itself increased the rate of psychopathology. And that is when we control for the pre-rape high tendency. When we had this modest treatment effect, then we have been looking around the world to see if there's some treatment that is better than others. And we found a Dutch model, the STEPS model for adolescents, 9 times of CBT, and parallel sessions for parents, and that has yielded very impressive results. None or very few existing cases of PTSD after treatment. The attrition rate was also negligible, and the intervention was not acute, but started after 3 months. But these are very impressive treatment results. We tested the STEPS model in Aarhus with acute victims, not just young ones, and in most cases without parents or friends. The results were not so outstanding as in the Netherlands, but with noticeable improvement. We're looking for other treatment methods that might be more effective, and we know in Utrecht now EMDR is being tested for acute victims, and we are following their work there. And internationally, the issue of retaining young victims for a long enough period so the treatment can work is acknowledged. Most recently at an international conference for survivors of rape in Finland last November. But if you look at the organizational structures, I think there are some challenges that are very important to be aware of. And that is that the number of acute victims is relatively modest. That is the one who comes seek help. About 600 per year in Denmark. That is 1 out of 10,000 in the population. But the total number is increasing as old rapes are now accepted in the centers. In the beginning it was just the acute cases because they didn't want to be overwhelmed. They want to control the number of clients. The 9 Danish centers are small. The professional environments are weak. The head is often a nurse or a doctor who's not involved in the psychological treatment after the initial contact. And that is why this international organization for survivors of rape was started in 2008. And the environment is the hospital, but the medical issues are actually minor in most cases. So my thoughts about this is that due to the large vulnerabilities, the acute crisis models seem insufficient in many cases, as personality and social problems, previous trauma, and psychopathology is abundant. Involving the rape victims network for a more robust intervention appears a necessary step. But many young people rebel against their families, so it can be hard to involve their network. But I think that could be a crucial thing, Rachel. The family perspective. A close cooperation with research has revealed problems that might not otherwise have been discovered, and a quest for other intervention methods has started. Now I turn to another institution that treats incest survivors. And again, we have the definition problem. How do we define incest? Is it about sexual touch, talk, watch, mutuality? What kind of relationship is included? What kind of age and age difference is included? I'll not delve into that, but just mention it as a starting point. There's an interesting thing about prevalence, because in many textbooks you see very high numbers. Bessel van der Kolk told me some years ago that when he was a student, a medical student, he had a textbook that said 1 in a million, there were only 1 in a million incest survivors. So that's a problem you didn't have to care about, was the idea. But we have made a number of studies, and it seems that about 2% of the population of the every year, 2% of the population has been victims of incest. And we have done that in different ways, with just one question, with several questions, and also in a group of 24 years old with latent class analysis. We identified this number. And the incest survivors have a lot of other problems next to the sexual assault, aggravated assault, rape, death, and childhood neglect and physical abuse is very common in this population. And this is some of the consequences of having been maltreated in childhood, where we compared sexual abuse with emotional abuse and polyvictimization. And that is when you're physically assaulted and neglected and also experience emotional abuse as a child. And luckily, a large part of the population has no abuse, but about 14% has been abused. And here you see the numbers of PTSD for the 3 groups, and then that is present PTSD. And then you see the odds ratios for criminality, for weight problems, where the sexually abused are overrepresented in the obesity group, and the emotional abuse is overrepresented in the underweight group with a BMI lower than 18.5, and the polyvictimized is overrepresented both in the overweight and obese group. And for other outcomes, ADHD, you see larger odd ratios that have many school problems. And there's also abuse problems and very large abuse problems for girls, also for boys, but not that high. And there's no one in this cell because there were too few boys that had been sexually abused that were also had alcohol abuse. But there are large consequences later in life. And in another study, when I was validating the Danish version of the MCMI, the personality measure, we found that the incest survivors were doing worse on almost all Axis 1 and Axis 2 scales. And that was very impressive because you were compared with 8 other clinical groups. Now here you can see the number of clinical disorders, which is very high level of anxiety, dysthymia, depression, considerable number of somatoform and thought disorders for this group. And next to this, there's also a lot of personality disorders. Many of them are dependent or evasive, avoidant or schizoid, and also quite a few borderline. So we have a double diagnosis problems with this group. And recently we also studied other diagnoses. More than 40% had dissociative PTSD, 45% had complex PTSD, and very few were secure attached. And there's something important to know about the age development, that the median age for childhood sexual abuse is 6 years. The median duration is about 5 years. Median age when you disclose is 21 years. And the median age when you start in therapy is 34 years. So there is a lot of delays, and it would be very important if you could change that so people would disclose earlier or they could start in therapy earlier. These are for people who come to the incest treatment centers. So the way these centers work, that is that they work with assessment. And this assessment takes place at intake and every 6 months, and it includes measures for PTSD and for personality disorders and clinical disorders. The therapy is based on the STAIR models that has been developed by Marilyn Crotter, and also based on personality-guided therapy after Theodore Millon. The average time in therapy is 1.5 years, once a week. The treatment is free and government supported. The effect size are good, are high. And many aspects has been analyzed in 15 recent publications from our group. When we look at the organizational aspects, then there are 3 regional centers. 2 of them have satellite centers. All leaders are psychologists, all staff are psychologists, but the secretaries. The center have all a voluntary section. The integration of the 2 has been very challenging, but eventually successful due to some extra money from the Ministry of Social Affairs. They bribed the voluntary section partners. But the grants has been temporary, and on 2 occasions a closed down process has started, which has been very devastating for the centers. But now the centers are permanent until 2021. Permanent. But there are some present political issues, and that is that the funding mechanism has just been abolished. And this mechanism was that you take the annual increases that follow the labor market from the pensions. They sort of call it, they lock this annual, they lock the pensions, and then give this money to the most vulnerable groups, prostitutes, drug addicts, homeless, and other groups. But as this mechanism has stopped this last year that it's running, so a consultancy firm and our center are involved in preparing plans for the Ministry of Social Affairs by examining various scenarios, such as should the centers continue and expand, and could we place the cost at the annual finance bill, or should the treatment centers be placed in the 98 municipalities in Denmark, or should the treatment be placed in the regions as part of psychiatry? This consultancy strategy is a way of making a break while the political agenda is negotiated, because the municipality has no tradition for treatment except with family treatment after domestic violence, run mainly by social workers and counselors with little training and with no formal assessment. The regions, the psychiatry wards, are eager to get the assignment, but experience tells that the hospital system and ICD-10 overrules most therapy attempts. They don't work trauma-informed within psychiatry. They work with one diagnosis in packets and not with the whole person. However, there are 2 hospitals that have incest survivor groups. The consultants / we will present various scenarios, and the politicians will choose what they like best. The process will be followed by a group of civil servants from 3 ministries. Part of the decision background will be mapping and analysis that has to be done in a very short time, 3.5 months. And a thorough mapping of the regional centers was done by our center some years ago. So one can just pray for a reasonable solution as a general election will come up in the same period. And will there be a change of guards there? Now I'll move to a third sector, the abused children. After a number of scandals where many Danish municipalities had ignored warnings in child cases, the government made a child packet in 2013, resulting in 5 regional child houses where police interrogation could be recorded, where the children could be assessed, and the families supported in acute crisis. That's again the gate principle. They put them in one place and all the professionals come to the same place. The number of children is now about 1,500 per year and has increased every year. By law, all physical and sexual abuse cases must be processed in the child houses. They are not, but they should be. By law, the municipalities, now we come to the organizational aspect. By law, the municipalities are obliged to pay the cost of the child houses according to their population. That is 60% of the base rate, base cost of the child houses. And the last 40% is according to the use of the centers. And that's a very smart mechanism, because it means that the centers can solve their primary task without thinking of economy. If there's more intake, they can hire more staff. And they don't have to be concerned about the finances. But by law, the centers have to be child-friendly in the interior and in their ways of working, and according to a satisfaction measure, they score high, 9 out of 10. One of the centers is enmeshed in a municipality office and gets strangled in bureaucratic procedures. It doesn't function very well. The heads are psychologists or social workers. Half of the staff are psychologists, the other half social workers. This has created tension because the psychologists have insisted that there are certain assessment tasks that they are better trained to do. Now a modus vivendi has been established between the two groups in all centers. We have trained the staff in assessment procedures, and we used specific test instruments, the diagnostic infant and preschool assessment, a systematic interview with a custody parent with children aged 1 to 6. The interview has been developed by Michael Scherenka. And then the direct cartoon test for PTSD assessment in children 6 to 12. And then our own contribution, the Odense Child Trauma Screen in children aged 4 to 8, a STEM story method combined with a Lego dollhouse, which we have standardized and validated. And in addition, there are other measures used as the Beck Youth Inventory, Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, BRIEF, that's a cognitive measure for smaller children, and others. This is the DIPA manual. This is a DARE in Danish, where you read the text aloud, and then the child sees the picture, and then he or she points at one of the thermometers, if it's never, sometimes, or most of the time. And here is the Lego dollhouse that's used for the child trauma screen. Our current strategy with the child houses is that we try to make the 5 centers a unity, working with the same time and same procedures. We serve them with free training and supervision in using the validated age and developmental sensitive tools. And in return, we collect test and assessment data and abuse data for research. And we also right now prepare a study of how the municipalities receive and use the child house assessment, because the municipalities have to deliver the interventions that the child houses propose. But do they? And how much do they invest? And can the assessment point to or argue that a specific intervention should take place? Do they ignore the assessment, or do they follow them, or do they pick out certain things that they can afford? And the great thing is that the municipality has accepted to do this study and also to deliver all the materials. So we don't have to go and ask them, they have accepted it. Secondary traumatization, as we have heard about in staff as well as in police and in municipality caseworkers, is also being studied, and recommendations will be brought forward to these professional groups. So in addition to serve the children, we also serve the servants. So if I should try to conclude something about this is that the interpersonal traumas have huge adverse effects. They can be treated and the victims can be healed or reach a level of improvement in symptoms and functioning. But leadership and organizational issues can spoil all professional development. So they have to be attended to or solved before any meaningful research can be implemented in intervention. And when you fail, other strategies might work. With the rape center, we lost a strong local commitment some years ago, but we have started a new process that involves all the Nordic centers, so we try to reach them in another way. Research can support development, but it's not decisive. Think of that. Securing evidence is not enough. Our politicians say that it is essential, but that is not the case. They have interest, and they have to negotiate the interest of various parties. If you can adapt your plan to their interest, you might be successful no matter what the evidence says. Sometimes the space of decision is more open. Sometimes new institutions are created. Sometimes there are scandals. That means that the authorities want to make changes, and you have a better chance to succeed with your endeavors if evidence has been collected and if you can attract the support of politicians or strong interest groups, which we see mainly in the medical fields, where the cancer groups are very strong. So the quality of the work is not yet a parameter, as it is in the medical work, because, for instance, in Denmark, all medical departments are regularly assessed and compared, a national list, and you can study this list, and I think it has an immense impact on the quality of the work. And sometimes hospital wards are the assignments, that the type of treatment they do is taken away from the hospital because they don't perform well enough. So it's removed to other hospitals. This development has not come within psychology, but I think that is something, good things about it. There's also drawbacks to this method, but we must, I think, continue to measure our work and assessing clients and their progress, and that's necessary steps in the development of effective treatment. And then, do we have the organization? Can we get the organizations where we can do the optimal treatment? This is not secured. This is a part of a political process where the organizational aspects play a major role. Thank you.
Thank you, Ask. May I quote from the letter I got from the next speaker that for her, Zahava means the world for her. Wow. What a sentence. I'm honored really to invite Professor Evelyn Broment. She's currently Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Preventive Medicine at Stony Brook University. After the Yale University PhD program and in epidemiology, she did her postdoc at Stanford University and then spent a decade at the University of Pittsburgh, where Zahava, I believe, met her for the first time about 3 years ago. 4 years ago, sorry. Okay. She conducted research on the mental health consequences of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant accident, as well as occupational lead and solvent exposure and work stress. She moved to Stony Brook in 1986 and began the work in Suffolk County Mental Health Project, a long-term study of first admission with psychosis to this psychiatric hospital in Suffolk County. She also did the research on 11 and 19-year-old children evacuated to Kiev as infants after the Chernobyl meltdown, their mothers, and Chernobyl cleanup workers. As part of the World Mental Health Survey Consortium, headed by Professor Ronald Kessler, she conducted the National Survey of Mental Health and Alcoholism in Ukraine. Over the past decade, her work was focused on the mental and physical health of the World Trade Center responders, monitored at the Stony Brook Health Program. She has been consultant to the US and International Mental Health and Radiation Health Organization, edited 4 books, and served as advisory to many outstanding students. And her research has been funded primarily by the NIH and AOSH. Professor Bromet, please.